The first thing that made me uncomfortable was that the bartender knew my name before I had ever told him. I'd gone into the place because it was raining heavily and I needed somewhere to wait for my ride. I wasn't drinking. I ordered a soda, found a seat near the back, and texted my friend that I'd be there for about 20 minutes. The bar was almost empty that night. There were only 4 other customers, all sitting far apart. Music played quietly from an old speaker behind the counter, and rain tapped against the front windows hard enough to make the street outside look blurred. The bartender set my drink down and said, "Here you go, Alex." I looked up immediately. "How do you know my name?" He smiled. "Lucky guess." I didn't think much of it at first. My friend had told me about the place, so maybe he'd mentioned my name earlier. I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, the bartender walked past and said, "Your friend running late?" I looked at him. "Yeah, about 10 minutes." He nodded and continued wiping the counter. That was when I realized I hadn't told him I was waiting for anyone. I looked toward the other customers. One of them was an older man sitting alone near the window. He was looking outside, but every few seconds his eyes moved toward me. I ignored it. I figured I was tired and becoming overly aware of everything around me. My friend eventually texted me saying traffic was worse than expected. Another 20 minutes. I decided to stay. Around 15 minutes later, the bartender placed another soda in front of me. "I didn't order this." "It's on the house." I pushed it aside. "I'm good," he smiled. "Suit yourself." Then he walked away. I noticed something strange about the glass. There was a small piece of blue tape wrapped around the bottom. I looked at my original drink. It had the same piece of tape. I asked the bartender why. He looked at the glasses and shrugged. "Just how we mark certain orders." "What does it mean?" "Nothing important." He walked away before I could ask anything else. I checked my phone again. No new messages. I called my friend, straight to voicemail. That was unusual, but the weather was bad and I assumed the signal was weak. Then the older man by the window stood up. He walked toward the restroom, stopped beside my table, and quietly said, "Don't take the second drink." I stared at him. "Why?" He didn't answer. He continued walking. I looked at the untouched glass. My stomach tightened. I stood up and went toward the restroom hallway, thinking maybe I'd ask him what he meant. He was gone. There was only a back door with a red exit sign above it. I returned to my seat. The bartender was watching me. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah." He smiled. "Your friend should be here soon." Again, I hadn't told him my friend was coming. I picked up my phone and opened the location sharing screen. My friend still wasn't moving toward the bar. I called again. No answer. I decided to leave. I walked toward the entrance and the bartender called after me. "Alex?" I turned around. "Your friend said you'd wait." I froze. "What did you say?" He stared at me for a moment. Then he laughed quietly. "Nothing." I opened the door and stepped into the rain. My friend called almost immediately. "Where are you?" she asked. I told her I was outside the bar. She sounded confused. "I haven't even left yet." I asked her what she meant. She said she'd never called the bar or spoken to anyone there. I looked back through the window. The bartender was standing behind the counter, watching me. I walked across the street and waited beneath an awning. My friend finally arrived about 15 minutes later. I told her everything. She wanted to call the police, but I wasn't sure there was enough to report. We went back the next morning with another friend. The place was closed. A printed notice on the door said the business was temporarily shut down because of an electrical problem. We called the number listed online. Nobody answered. A few days later, I searched the place again. The reviews had disappeared. The business page was gone. I eventually found an old local news article saying the building had changed owners several times. Nothing about the previous bar seemed unusual. Months passed. I stopped thinking about it. Then one afternoon, my friend sent me a screenshot. She had found a social media photo from inside the bar taken several months before I visited. In the background was a small shelf behind the counter. On it were dozens of drinking glasses, each marked with different colored pieces of tape. Underneath the photo, someone had commented, "They still use the old system." My friend asked what that meant. I didn't know. I never found out. The strangest part is that the bartender wasn't listed as an employee anywhere. The older man who warned me was never identified either. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for all of it. Maybe the bartender knew my name because someone had mentioned it. Maybe the second drink really was harmless. Maybe the man by the window was simply trying to scare me. But I still remember the way the bartender looked at me when I walked out. Not angry, not surprised, almost disappointed. And whenever I'm somewhere unfamiliar now, I don't accept food or drinks I didn't order, and I don't assume someone knows harmless things about me just because they act friendly. Sometimes the first warning isn't something threatening. Sometimes it's simply realizing that a stranger knows more about you than they should. I only went into the bar because my phone was almost dead, and the rain outside had become too heavy to keep walking. I was driving home late after visiting a friend when my car started making a strange noise, so I pulled into a small town I'd never been to before. The mechanic's shop was closed, my phone had 12% battery, and the nearest hotel was several miles away. Across the street was a small bar with a glowing red sign above the entrance. I almost kept driving, but the rain was coming down so hard that I decided to wait there until morning. The place looked ordinary from outside. A few cars were parked in front, music was playing quietly, and there were people sitting near the windows. I walked in and immediately noticed how warm it was compared to outside. There were maybe 8 customers inside. I took a seat near the entrance and asked the bartender if I could charge my phone. He pointed toward an outlet beside the wall. Sure, I plugged it in and ordered a soda. He gave me one, then went back to cleaning glasses. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. I watched the rain through the front windows and checked my car through the glass whenever lightning illuminated the parking lot. Then, a man sitting at the end of the counter looked over at me. He was probably in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap and an old work jacket. "Car trouble?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah." He glanced outside. "Bad night for it." I smiled politely and went back to my phone. A few minutes later, he said, "You shouldn't leave it out there." I looked at him. "Leave what?" He nodded toward my car. "Your driver's door isn't locked." I immediately looked through the window. I couldn't tell from that distance. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Pretty sure." I thanked him and stood up. The bartender called from behind the counter. "I'd leave it. Storm's getting worse." I hesitated. The man at the counter looked toward the bartender. Neither of them said anything else. I decided to check anyway. I walked outside, crossed the parking lot, and tried the driver's door. It was locked. I stood there for a second, confused. Maybe the man had simply been mistaken. When I returned inside, he wasn't sitting at the counter anymore. I looked around. "Where'd he go?" The bartender shrugged. "Bathroom." I sat down again. My phone was charging slowly. I checked the time. 11:48 p.m. The bartender came over and asked, "You staying here tonight?" I told him I was waiting for the rain to slow down. He nodded. "Probably smart." Then he looked toward the front windows. "You shouldn't sleep in your car, though." I laughed awkwardly. I wasn't planning to. He smiled. "Good." About 10 minutes later, the man returned from the hallway. He sat down again and ordered another drink. He looked at me. "Door locked?" I said yes. He smiled. "Good." I didn't like that answer. I asked him why he'd been looking at my car in the first place. He shrugged. "Just noticed it." I nodded and tried to ignore him. Then I heard something outside, a vehicle door closing. I looked through the window. A dark SUV was parked beside my car. I didn't remember seeing it before. The engine was off and nobody appeared to be inside. I turned back toward the bar. The bartender was staring at the SUV. The older man was staring too. I asked, "Whose vehicle is that?" Neither answered immediately. Finally, the bartender said, "Probably somebody from the kitchen." I looked toward the kitchen. "There's a kitchen?" He nodded. "Small one." That explanation seemed strange because I'd never seen anyone going in or out of it. I decided to call the mechanic again. No answer. I checked my phone. 20% battery. Then a notification appeared from my car's roadside assistance app. Someone had opened the vehicle door. I stared at the screen. I hadn't touched the car since I checked it. I looked through the window. The SUV was still there. My car's interior light was on. I stood up. "Someone's in my car." The bartender immediately said, "Don't go outside." His voice was different this time, serious. I asked him to call the police. He picked up the phone behind the counter. Before he could dial, the older man grabbed his wrist. "Wait." The bartender looked at him. "What?" The man whispered something I couldn't hear. Then both of them looked toward me. I took a step backward. "What's going on?" Nobody answered. The front door opened. A younger man walked inside wearing a dark rain jacket. Water dripped from his shoulders. He looked around the room and then directly at me. The bartender said, "We're closed." The man didn't respond. He looked at the older customer. The older customer slowly shook his head. The younger man turned around and walked back outside. I asked the bartender, "Who is that?" He said, "I don't know." I didn't believe him. I grabbed my phone and moved toward the bathroom hallway because it was the only direction away from the front door. The older man followed me. "Listen," he whispered. "Don't panic." I stopped. "Why are you telling me that?" He looked toward the bartender. "Because I think you need to leave through the back." "Why?" "Because those men aren't here for the bar." I stared at him. "Who are they?" He shook his head. "I don't know." Then he said something that made everything worse. "But they have been watching the parking lot for about an hour." I asked why he hadn't told me earlier. He looked embarrassed. I wasn't sure. I heard the front door open again. Someone walked inside. The older man pushed me toward the hallway. "Go." I didn't argue. We moved through a narrow corridor behind the kitchen. The bartender followed us. He opened a metal door at the end. Behind it was a small alley. Rain was still pouring. "Where does this go?" I asked. "Behind the building," he said. "There's a gas station around the corner." I ran. I didn't look back. The older man stayed behind. I reached the gas station and called emergency services. Police arrived within minutes. When they returned with me, the bar was empty. The bartender was gone. So was the older man. My car was still there. The driver's door was closed. Nothing appeared stolen. Police checked the vehicle and found muddy footprints near the driver's side, but no useful evidence. The dark SUV was gone. The next morning, I went back to the mechanic and had my car inspected. They found nothing wrong with it. I kept thinking about the bar, so I searched for it online. That's when I discovered something strange. The business had been listed under a different name only a few months earlier. There were almost no reviews. One old review simply said, "Don't go there alone." I assumed it was probably nothing. A week later, I received a message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. "You forgot your charger." I still had my charger. I checked it immediately. It was sitting on my desk. I never told anyone my phone had been charging at the bar. I reported the message, but the number disappeared before police could trace it. I never found out who sent it. The bar closed a few months later. According to a local article, the owner had decided not to renew the lease. Nothing was ever officially connected to the incident. Maybe the people outside were involved in something unrelated. Maybe the bartender and the older man were trying to protect me. Maybe they knew exactly what was happening and simply didn't want to explain it. I don't know. What I do know is that I still remember the older man's face when he told me not to panic. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for me. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had ignored him and walked back across that parking lot alone. Because I went into that bar thinking it was the safest place I could find during a storm. By the time I left, I wasn't sure whether the people inside had protected me from something outside, or whether they were part of the reason I had needed protection in the first place. I only went into the bar because my car wouldn't start. It was around midnight, raining hard enough that I couldn't see much farther than the headlights, and the nearest gas station was several miles behind me. The bar was the only building still lit up along that stretch of road. I parked outside and went in hoping I could use a phone. There were only 5 people inside. The bartender was wiping down the counter, a couple sat in a booth near the window, and a man in a brown jacket was sitting alone at the far end. I walked up to the counter and said, "Sorry, do you have a phone I could use?" The bartender looked at me for a second before answering, "Sure." He handed me an old landline. I called roadside assistance, but they told me the nearest driver was at least an hour away because of the weather. I thanked the bartender and asked if I could wait inside. "Of course," he said. "Take a seat." I chose a table near the entrance. About 10 minutes later, the man in the brown jacket walked past me. He stopped and looked at my car through the window. "That's yours?" he asked. I said yes. He nodded. "You shouldn't leave it unlocked." I told him it was locked. He smiled. "Check again." I didn't understand why he cared, but I went outside anyway. The car was locked. When I came back inside, he was sitting at the bar again. "Locked?" he asked. I nodded. "Good." I sat down and tried to ignore him. Around 12:30, the couple left. The bartender locked the door behind them. I noticed him turning the sign from open to closed. I asked if he was shutting down. He said, "Normally, yeah, but you can stay until your ride gets here." I thanked him. The man in the brown jacket remained at the counter. 10 minutes later, the bartender looked through the front window and said, "That's strange." I asked what he saw. He pointed outside. A dark sedan had pulled into the parking lot. It stopped beside my car but didn't turn off its headlights. Nobody got out. We watched it for nearly a minute. Then it slowly drove away. The man in the brown jacket suddenly stood up. "I'm leaving." The bartender looked at him. "You sure?" He nodded. Before opening the door, he looked directly at me. "Don't go outside until your ride arrives." Then he left through the back door. I looked at the bartender. "What's that about?" He shook his head. "No idea." I believed him at first. Then the phone behind the counter rang. He answered it. "Hello?" He listened for a few seconds. "Wrong number." He hung up. The phone rang again. Same number. This time he didn't answer. It rang a third time. He unplugged it. I asked what was going on. He said, "Probably nothing." A few minutes later, headlights appeared outside again. The same dark sedan. This time it parked directly beside the entrance. The driver's window rolled down. Nobody got out. The bartender locked the front door even though it was already locked. "Stay away from the windows," he said. I moved toward the back of the room. "Do you know them?" He didn't answer. Then we heard the sound of someone trying the front door. Once, then again. The bartender stood behind the counter and watched. Nobody spoke. After about 30 seconds, the handle stopped moving. The car drove away. I asked whether he was calling the police. He said he already had. We waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No police arrived. The bartender looked increasingly nervous. He checked his phone several times. Finally, he said, "Your ride should be here soon." I told him roadside assistance had said an hour. He looked at the clock. "It's been an hour." I checked my phone. The roadside company had sent me a notification. The driver was approaching. I felt relieved. Then another notification appeared. The driver had canceled. I called the company. The representative told me the driver had marked the job as unsafe and left the area. I asked what that meant. She said the driver hadn't provided details. I looked at the bartender. He had heard me. "You can stay here," he said. I nodded. About 5 minutes later, the back door opened. The man in the brown jacket stepped inside. He looked at the bartender. "They're still out there?" The bartender nodded. I asked, "Who are they?" The man looked at me. "I don't know." "Then why did you tell me not to go outside?" He hesitated. "Because they were watching your car." I asked how he knew. He didn't answer. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I saw them do this before." The bartender looked at him sharply. "Don't." The man ignored him. "A woman came in here last winter. Her car broke down. Same thing happened. Someone sat outside watching her." I asked what happened to her. Neither man answered. The silence told me enough. I stood up. "I'm calling the police myself." I pulled out my phone. Before I could dial, the lights went out. The entire bar went dark. The emergency lights came on a few seconds later. The bartender whispered, "Stay here." We heard the front door handle move again. Then someone knocked. 3 times. The man in the brown jacket grabbed my arm. "Back room, now." We moved behind the bar and into a storage room. The bartender locked the door from the inside. We could hear footsteps outside. Someone walked through the bar slowly. A chair scraped across the floor. A glass fell and broke. Nobody spoke. Then the footsteps stopped outside the storage room. The door handle moved, once, twice. Then someone said, "We know she's in there." I felt my entire body go cold. The bartender looked at me. He mouthed, "Don't move." We waited. After what felt like several minutes, the footsteps moved away. Then the front door slammed. A car engine started outside. The bartender waited another minute before unlocking the door. We stepped back into the bar. The police finally arrived less than 5 minutes later. They searched the building and parking lot but found nobody. The dark sedan was gone. The man in the brown jacket gave the officers a statement and left before I could ask him anything else. The bartender stayed behind. Police checked the exterior cameras. They discovered the power had been intentionally shut off at the electrical panel outside. They also found tire tracks belonging to the sedan. Nothing came of it. There wasn't enough evidence to identify anyone. I eventually got my car towed and stayed at a motel in the next town. The following morning, I searched online for the bar. That's when I found an old local newspaper article about a woman whose car had broken down there the previous winter. She'd gone into the same bar to wait for assistance. According to the article, she disappeared that night. Her vehicle was found the next morning on the side of the road several miles away. She was never located. I contacted the police and told them what I'd learned. They already knew about the case. They asked whether the man in the brown jacket had mentioned it. I said yes. The officer paused. Did he give you his name? I told him I didn't know it. The officer said they had never identified anyone matching his description from the original case. I never found out who he was. I don't know whether he was trying to warn me or whether he knew more than he admitted. The bartender eventually sold the business. I never went back. What still bothers me is that nobody ever explained why the people outside were watching my car. They never tried to rob the bar. They never took money. They never demanded anything. They seemed interested only in me leaving. And sometimes I wonder if the man in the brown jacket saved me that night because he'd recognized the pattern from the earlier disappearance, or because he already knew exactly what was about to happen. I almost left the bar with a stranger because I thought he was the person my friend had sent to pick me up. That mistake still bothers me because there was nothing obviously threatening about him. He wasn't aggressive, drunk, or acting strangely. He was just a normal-looking guy standing near the entrance on a rainy Friday night, holding his phone and waiting for someone. I had gone to a small neighborhood bar after work because a friend was supposed to meet me there. It wasn't a crowded place. There were maybe 15 people inside, low music playing, and rain running down the windows. I'd been there about an hour when my friend texted me that she couldn't make it. She apologized and said her cousin would pick me up instead. I asked what he looked like. She replied, "Dark jacket, gray baseball cap, you'll know him." That wasn't exactly helpful, but I figured I'd recognize him. About 20 minutes later, a man matching that description walked in. He looked around the room, checked his phone, and then looked directly at me. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. I said, "Yeah." He smiled. "I'm here for you." I stood up. Then the bartender called my name. "Hey, your friend just messaged the bar phone." I froze. "What?" He pointed toward the landline. "She said her cousin was running late." I looked back at the man. His expression changed slightly. Not much, but enough. "I must have misunderstood," he said. He turned toward the door. I asked, "What's your name?" He stopped. "Mike?" I waited. "Mike what?" He smiled. "She didn't tell you?" Then he walked outside. I watched him disappear into the rain. I called my friend immediately. She answered on the first ring. I asked, "What does your cousin look like?" She laughed. "I haven't sent him yet." I looked through the window. The man was gone. I told her what happened. She went quiet. "Don't leave the bar," she said. I didn't. I told the bartender everything. He locked the front door and told me to sit near the counter. "You did the right thing," he said. "People do stupid things when they're waiting for rides." I tried to calm down. Maybe the guy had simply made a lucky guess. Maybe he had seen my friend talking to me earlier. Maybe someone had overheard the conversation. There were plenty of explanations. Then the bartender showed me something. A few minutes earlier, someone had called the bar and asked whether a woman matching my description was inside. The bartender had refused to answer. I asked what description they'd given. He said, "Brown coat, black boots, sitting near the window." I looked down at myself. That was exactly what I was wearing. I hadn't told anyone what I was wearing except my friend. I asked whether the caller had given a name. The bartender shook his head. No. Around 10 minutes later, my friend's cousin actually arrived. He was wearing a blue hoodie and driving a silver sedan. Definitely not the man I'd spoken to. He came inside and immediately asked what happened. I told him. He looked toward the door. "Did the guy touch you?" I said no. He seemed relieved. We left together through the back entrance because the bartender didn't want me walking through the front. Outside, the parking lot was almost empty. As we reached the car, my friend's cousin stopped. "That's weird." He pointed toward the far end of the lot. A dark SUV was parked beneath a streetlight. Someone was sitting inside. The engine was running. We got into the car. The SUV remained there. My friend's cousin drove away slowly. The SUV followed. We made 3 turns. It followed everyone. He called the police while continuing toward a busy gas station. The SUV finally turned off before we reached it. Police arrived and took our statements. They checked the bar's security footage but couldn't identify the man. His face had been partially hidden by the baseball cap. The bartender remembered him coming in but said he never ordered anything. He'd stood near the entrance for less than 5 minutes. What bothered me most was how casually he'd approached me. There had been no threat, no obvious warning. He had simply said the exact thing I was hoping to hear. I didn't see him again. About 2 weeks later, the bartender called me. He said someone had left an envelope at the bar with my name written on it. I asked him to open it. He refused. I went there with my friend and found a single printed photograph inside. It was a picture of me sitting at the bar that night. The photo had clearly been taken from outside through the rain-covered window. On the back was a handwritten time, 11:42 p.m. I immediately contacted police. They took the photograph and checked the surrounding businesses for cameras. They found footage of a person standing across the street for almost an hour that night. The image was too blurry to identify them. The case eventually went nowhere. My friend changed the way she arranged rides after that. I stopped telling strangers who I was waiting for. I also stopped assuming that someone knowing my name meant they were safe. What still bothers me is that the man didn't need to force me outside. He didn't threaten me. He simply gave me a reason to believe he belonged there. And if the bartender hadn't happened to receive that phone call at exactly the right time, I probably would have walked out with him without asking another question. I still think about that whenever someone approaches me in a public place and says, "I'm here for you." Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one acting suspiciously. It's the one who gives you exactly the answer you were hoping to hear. The strangest thing about that night wasn't that someone followed me out of the bar. It was that they seemed to know when I was going to leave before I did. I had gone into a small bar outside Pittsburgh one Friday night because my car was having trouble, and I didn't want to wait on the side of the road in heavy rain. I wasn't there to drink. I ordered a soda, found a booth near the back, and called a friend who said he'd pick me up. The bartender was friendly and didn't ask many questions. There were only 6 or 7 customers inside, and most of them were watching a basketball game on the television above the bar. For the first half hour, everything felt completely normal. Then, a man sitting 2 booths away stood up, walked past me, and said quietly, "Your friend isn't coming." I looked up. "What?" He didn't stop. He just walked toward the restroom. I assumed he'd had too much to drink and ignored him. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. My friend had texted that he was running late. I remember thinking how strange the timing was. About 20 minutes later, the same man returned and sat down. He didn't look at me this time. I went back to watching the game. Then the bartender came over and said, "Your ride still coming?" I nodded. "Yeah, he'll be here soon." The bartender looked toward the windows. "Good." I asked why. He shrugged. "Roads are getting bad." I didn't think anything of it. Around midnight, my friend called. He said he'd arrived outside. I stood up and looked through the front window. His car wasn't there. I called him back. He said he was parked around the corner because the street was blocked by construction. That made sense. I grabbed my jacket. As I walked toward the door, the bartender said, "Wait." I stopped. "What?" He pointed toward the parking lot. "Let me check something." He walked to the window and looked outside. Then he turned back. "Your friend driving a gray car?" I nodded. "Yeah." The bartender stared through the glass for another few seconds. "There's a gray car out there." I felt relieved. That's probably him. The bartender didn't answer. I looked outside again. The car was parked beneath a broken street light. I couldn't see anyone inside. I called my friend. He answered immediately. I'm still around the corner. I looked at the gray car again. Then whose car is that? He went quiet. Don't go outside. I didn't. The bartender locked the front door. A few customers noticed and started asking questions. He told them there was a problem with the lock. The man from earlier was still sitting in his booth. He looked at the gray car, then at me. That's not your ride, he said. I asked how he knew. He shrugged. Just isn't. 10 minutes passed. The car didn't move. Then the headlights came on. The vehicle slowly pulled away and disappeared down the street. Everyone relaxed. I thought it was over. Then my friend called again. I'm here. This time I could hear his voice from outside. He had parked behind the building. The bartender opened the back door and watched until my friend came into the alley. I thanked him and left. My friend asked what had happened. I told him about the car. He looked toward the street. Weird. We drove home without seeing the vehicle again. I thought about the night for a few days, but eventually convinced myself that I had overreacted. Then, about a week later, I received a message from an unknown number. It said, "You shouldn't trust people who lock doors for you." I stared at it for several minutes. I hadn't told anyone about the bartender locking the door. I showed my friend, and he told me to report it. I did. The police asked whether I'd noticed anyone taking pictures or watching me that night. I said no. They couldn't do much with one anonymous message. I forgot about it again until a month later, when I returned to the area during the day. The bar was closed. A sign in the window said the business had changed ownership. I stopped to look at the sign and noticed a security camera above the entrance. I remembered there had been one inside too. I called the police department and asked whether they'd ever reviewed the footage from that night. They said there was no record of it being requested. I explained why I was asking. The officer suggested I speak with the new owner. I did. He told me the old camera system had been removed before he took over. He didn't know who had installed it. I asked whether he knew the bartender. He said he'd never met him. That was the part that bothered me. I'd assumed the bartender was simply an employee. But when I checked old reviews online, I couldn't find a single photograph showing him. Not one. A few months later, I learned the bar had actually closed for several weeks before reopening under a different owner. Nobody seemed to know exactly why. I never discovered who had been sitting in the gray car. I never learned who sent the message, and I never found out whether the man in the booth was trying to warn me or simply knew more than he wanted to say. The easiest explanation is probably that several unrelated things happened on the same night, and my mind connected them afterward. That's what I'd like to believe. I still remember the moment the bartender looked through that window and immediately knew something wasn't right. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd seen it before. And whenever I'm waiting for someone outside a crowded place now, I never tell strangers who I'm waiting for, how long they'll be, or what kind of car they're driving. Because that night taught me something I hadn't really understood before. Sometimes the safest person in a strange place is the person who admits they don't know what's happening. The people who act like they already understand everything are the ones I watch most carefully. I had been sitting at the bar for less than 20 minutes when the bartender quietly asked me if I knew the man sitting behind me. I turned around. There was a guy in his 40s sitting alone at the other end of the counter, looking down at his phone. I shook my head. Never seen him before. The bartender nodded and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. It was a Tuesday night, and the bar was almost empty. I'd stopped there after work because I didn't feel like going straight home. It was raining outside, and I remember thinking the place was unusually quiet for that hour. I ordered a soda, put my headphones on, and started scrolling through my phone. About 10 minutes later, the man behind me stood up and walked outside. I didn't pay attention. Then the bartender came over again. He left something. He pointed toward the stool where the man had been sitting. There was a folded napkin on the counter. I opened it without thinking. Inside was a handwritten number. Underneath it were 3 words. "Don't leave alone." I looked at the bartender. "What is this?" He shook his head. "I don't know." I asked whether the man had left it for me. He said he couldn't say. I immediately felt stupid for being nervous. It could have been some private note between customers. I folded it back up and left it on the counter. A few minutes later, the bartender picked it up and threw it away. "Probably nothing," he said. I agreed. Around 11, I decided to leave. I walked toward the front door and saw the man standing across the street under an awning. He was looking at his phone. When I stepped outside, he looked up. I stopped. He didn't approach me. He just watched. I walked toward my car. He stayed where he was. I unlocked the doors and got inside. Before starting the engine, I looked toward the bar. The bartender was standing in the doorway watching me. I waved. He didn't wave back. I started the car and drove away. About 5 minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. I assumed it was coincidence. I turned onto another street. The car followed. I made another turn. It followed again. I called my brother and stayed on the phone with him. I didn't tell him what I thought was happening. I just said I wanted someone to stay on the line until I got home. The headlights remained behind me for another 10 minutes. Then I noticed something strange. The car wasn't following closely. It stayed far enough back that I couldn't see the driver. Whenever I sped up, it sped up. Whenever I slowed down, it slowed down. I decided not to drive home. I went to a gas station instead. The car continued past me. I felt relieved. Then it made a U-turn at the next intersection. I went inside the gas station and told the cashier what was happening. She locked the front door and called the police. The car passed twice without stopping. About 15 minutes later, an officer arrived. He took my statement and checked the parking lot cameras. The vehicle had already left. There wasn't much they could do. I drove home with my brother following me. For the next few days, nothing happened. I convinced myself I'd imagined the connection between the bar and the car. Then, I received a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone to the gas station." I immediately showed my brother. I called the police again. They asked whether I'd given my phone number to anyone at the bar. I hadn't. The bartender had never asked for it. My brother told them about the note. They returned to the bar and spoke with the owner. According to the owner, the bartender hadn't been working there that night. I thought they were mistaken. I described him. The owner said there was no employee matching that description. I showed him a photo I'd taken earlier that evening. It was just a picture of my drink, but the bartender was visible in the background. The owner stared at it for several seconds. Then he said, "That's strange." I asked why. He pointed toward the back of the photo. There was a security mirror reflecting the bar. The man I'd seen sitting behind me was visible in the reflection, but the bartender wasn't. I didn't understand what he meant until he explained that the person I'd thought was the bartender was actually standing outside the camera's field of view. The owner said the man in my photo looked familiar, but couldn't identify him. I never found out who either person was. The police couldn't connect the text messages to anyone. The car was never identified. The bar stayed open, and I never went back. Maybe there was a completely ordinary explanation. Maybe the note belonged to someone else. Maybe the person behind me wasn't involved at all. But I still think about one detail. When I first walked into the bar, the bartender had asked me, "You drove here alone, right?" I had laughed and said yes. At the time, it sounded like small talk. Now I wonder why he needed to know. Because he didn't ask whether I wanted a drink. He didn't ask how my night was. He asked whether I was alone. And I didn't realize until much later that I'd answered him. I remember the exact moment I realized I should leave the bar, and it wasn't when the man started following me. It was when the bartender quietly moved my car keys from the edge of the counter to the other side of my glass. I'd been sitting there for maybe an hour, waiting for the rain to ease up. The bar was small, the kind of place with old wooden tables, a pool table in the back, and a television mounted above the bottles behind the counter. There were only a handful of people inside. I wasn't drinking. I'd ordered a soda because I still had to drive home. The bartender was friendly enough. He made small talk, asked where I was coming from, and complained about the weather. Nothing about him seemed unusual. Around 11:30, I checked my phone and realized my battery was almost dead. I put my keys beside my drink while I searched for a charger in my car. That's when the bartender picked them up. He didn't ask. He simply moved them farther down the counter. I looked at him. "Oh, sorry," he said. "Thought they were mine." I laughed because it seemed harmless. No problem. He put them back. A few minutes later, a man sitting alone near the pool table walked past me. He glanced at my keys and then at me. "You leaving soon?" he asked. "Probably." He nodded and continued toward the restroom. I didn't think much of it. Then my phone buzzed. It was my sister asking whether I'd gotten home yet. I replied that I was still at the bar. She asked me to text her when I left. I put the phone away. The bartender noticed. "Someone waiting for you?" he asked. I said my sister was. He nodded. Good. I remember that word because of how quickly he said it. A little later, the man from the pool table returned and sat at the stool beside me. He didn't order anything. He just looked at the television. After a minute, he said, "Roads are pretty bad tonight," I agreed. Yeah, he looked toward the windows. Wouldn't want to break down. I didn't respond. He smiled slightly. "Especially out here." Then he stood up and went outside. I watched him through the window. He walked across the parking lot and stopped beside my car. I immediately stood up. The bartender said, "Don't worry about it. He's by my car. He probably needs to get to his." I looked outside. There were only 3 cars in the parking lot. Mine, the bartender's truck, and the man's sedan. He wasn't anywhere near his own vehicle. He was standing beside mine. I went toward the door. The bartender stepped in front of it. "Give him a minute." I stared at him. "Why?" He hesitated. "He's probably just looking for something." I didn't like that answer. I moved around him and opened the door. The man outside immediately walked back toward his car. He didn't look at me. I went to my vehicle and checked the doors. They were locked. Nothing looked disturbed. When I returned, the man was gone. I sat back down but moved my keys into my pocket. About 20 minutes later, I received a message from my sister. "Why did you tell me you're leaving now?" I hadn't told her I was leaving. I called her. She said she had received a text from my number saying, "Leaving now. See you soon." I checked my phone. The message wasn't in my sent folder. She forwarded me a screenshot. It was definitely my number. I immediately checked my account security settings. Nothing looked wrong. I asked the bartender if anyone had used my phone. He said no. I didn't believe him. I told him I was leaving. He nodded. "Probably best." I stood up. The man from earlier was suddenly back inside. He was sitting near the entrance. I walked toward the door. He looked at me and said, "Your sister's expecting you?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned my sister to him. "How do you know that?" He smiled. "Lucky guess." I didn't answer. I walked outside and got into my car. I started the engine and drove away. I called my sister immediately. She told me to stay on the phone. I drove to a police station instead of going home. While I was driving, I noticed the same man's sedan behind me. I didn't know whether it was him, but the vehicle looked familiar. I turned onto a main road. It stayed behind me. I drove through 2 intersections, still there. Finally, I pulled into the police station parking lot. The sedan continued straight. I waited inside until an officer came outside. I explained what happened. He took down the license plate I'd managed to remember. They ran it. The vehicle was registered to a local man, but there was no evidence connecting him to the bar. I thought that would be the end of it. The next morning, my sister called me. She said someone had left an envelope underneath her windshield wiper. Inside was a printed photo of my car parked outside the bar. The photo had been taken that same night. On the back was written, "You should listen when people tell you to wait." I gave it to the police. They asked whether I'd noticed anyone taking pictures. I hadn't. The bar had security cameras, so investigators requested the footage. The cameras showed the man standing near my car, but there was a problem. The footage showed him arriving alone. It also showed him entering the bar alone. Nobody followed him. Nobody was seen taking the photograph. The officer told me the photo could have been taken from the street before the camera's view began. That was possible. A few weeks later, the bar closed temporarily. I never found out why. I also never learned whether the man had actually sent the messages from my phone or whether someone else had access to my number. The police couldn't prove anything. The bartender denied knowing the man, and the man denied ever approaching my car. Maybe he really was just a strange customer. Maybe someone else was responsible for the messages and photograph. But there's one thing I still can't explain. When I returned to the bar months later during the afternoon, the new bartender told me the previous owner had installed cameras after a customer complained about people watching cars in the parking lot. I asked when that happened. He said, "About 2 years ago." My night there had been the previous winter. I left without asking anything else. I haven't been back. I still keep my car keys in my pocket whenever I'm in an unfamiliar place, and I never leave my phone unattended, even for a minute. Maybe that's excessive. Maybe nothing truly dangerous happened that night. But I still remember the bartender moving my keys across the counter before anyone had given him a reason to think I was leaving. At the time, I thought it was a small, meaningless gesture. Now I wonder if he was simply being careless, or if he already knew someone was paying attention to where those keys were. I was sitting alone in a nearly empty bar when the bartender asked me a question that didn't make sense until I got home. "Did you park your car somewhere else?" I told him no. He looked through the front window toward the parking lot, then back at me. "Okay." He walked away without explaining. It was around 10:30 on a Thursday night, and I'd stopped there because I was driving home from work and needed a break. The place was quiet, with soft music playing and rain tapping against the windows. There were maybe 6 customers inside. I ordered a soda and sat in a booth where I could see the entrance. About 20 minutes later, a man in a gray hoodie came in, looked around, and sat at the bar. He didn't order anything. The bartender eventually asked if he wanted a drink. "I'm waiting for someone," the man replied. I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, the bartender walked past my booth and quietly said, "If you're waiting for someone too, don't tell him where you're going." I looked up. "Who?" The bartender glanced toward the man in the hoodie. "Just don't." I thought he was joking, but his face didn't look like he was. I decided to leave. When I stood up, the man in the hoodie immediately stood too. He walked toward the restroom. I waited. After a minute, I went toward the entrance. The bartender called after me. "Your car's not outside." I stopped. "What?" He pointed through the window. I looked at the parking lot. My car was there. "It's right there," he frowned. "That's not what I meant." I didn't understand. I opened the door. The man in the hoodie came out of the restroom behind me. "You leaving?" he asked. "Yeah." He smiled. "Same." I walked outside. He followed several steps behind. I got into my car and locked the doors. He continued toward the opposite side of the parking lot. I started the engine and watched him through the mirror. He stood beside another vehicle. Then he called someone. I couldn't hear what he said. I drove away. For the next 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then I noticed a car behind me. I couldn't tell whether it was the same one. I made a turn. It followed. I turned again. It followed. I drove toward a busy gas station and pulled in. The car continued past. I waited several minutes before leaving. When I finally reached home, there was a missed call from an unknown number. I didn't return it. The next morning, the bartender called me. I had never given him my number. He said, "Did you get home okay?" I asked how he had my phone number. He paused. "You gave it to me last night." I hadn't. I asked him to explain. He said he couldn't. Then he hung up. I immediately checked my phone account. Nothing appeared compromised. I called the bar later that afternoon. A different employee answered. I asked for the bartender. She said, "He doesn't work here." I described him. She said nobody matching that description had worked there for several months. I thought she was mistaken. I went back that evening. The bar was the same, but the bartender I remembered wasn't there. I showed the employee a photo I'd taken that night. She stared at it. The photo was of my drink, but the bartender was visible behind the counter. She said, "That's the previous manager." I asked why he had called me. She didn't know. I asked about the man in the gray hoodie. She said she'd seen him before but didn't know his name. Then she asked me something strange. "Did he ask you where you lived?" I said no. She nodded. "Good." I asked why. She refused to answer. I left. A week later, I received another call from an unknown number. Nobody spoke. I could hear rain in the background. Then the line disconnected. I ignored it. 2 weeks later, the bar closed permanently. I eventually found a local article mentioning that police had investigated several complaints involving customers being followed after leaving the establishment. No charges were filed. The article didn't name anyone. I never learned whether the bartender had been trying to protect me or whether he had been part of something I didn't understand. The strangest part is that I still can't explain his first question. Did you park your car somewhere else? My car was clearly visible through the window. He couldn't have mistaken it. Sometimes I wonder if he wasn't asking where my car was at all. Maybe he was asking whether I'd noticed another car parked nearby. Maybe he'd seen something I hadn't. I'll never know. But I don't go into unfamiliar bars alone anymore, especially when the place is nearly empty. And if someone asks me where I'm headed after I leave, I don't answer. I just keep walking. I didn't realize the man at the end of the bar had been listening to my conversation until he repeated something I'd only said once. And that's what made me leave. It was a Wednesday night, and I'd stopped at a small bar on the edge of town because my apartment building was having some plumbing work done, and I didn't want to sit there listening to the noise. I wasn't drinking. I ordered a Coke, found a booth near the wall, and called my friend Daniel to see if he wanted to meet me. He couldn't make it, so we talked for a few minutes before I hung up. The bar was quiet that night. There were maybe 10 people inside, most of them watching a game on a television above the counter. I remember the place smelling like old wood, fried food, and rain because I'd walked in from a storm. Nothing about it felt dangerous. That's probably why what happened later bothered me so much. I was halfway through my drink when the bartender came over and asked if I needed anything else. I said no. He nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, the man sitting at the far end of the bar looked over and said, "Daniel isn't coming?" I looked at him. "What?" He took a sip from his glass. "Your friend. You were talking to him." I hadn't realized anyone was listening. I smiled awkwardly. "No, he's busy." The man nodded and looked back at the television. I told myself it was nothing. We were in a small room. He could have heard the entire conversation. Still, I moved my chair slightly so my back was against the wall. About 15 minutes later, I got a message from Daniel. He said he'd forgotten to tell me something important and asked if I could call him. I stepped outside because the music inside had gotten louder. I stood underneath the awning and called him. He told me he'd accidentally left his wallet at my apartment earlier that week and wanted to know if I'd seen it. I laughed and told him I hadn't. We talked for maybe 2 minutes. When I went back inside, the man at the end of the bar was still there. He didn't look at me. I sat down and checked my phone. A notification popped up saying my phone had connected to a nearby Bluetooth device. I didn't recognize the name. I turned Bluetooth off. A few seconds later, the notification appeared again. I checked the list. The device was gone. I assumed it was someone else's headphones or speaker. Then the bartender came over and said, "You okay?" I told him about the Bluetooth notification. He shrugged. Probably somebody's earbuds. That made sense. I went back to my drink. About 10 minutes later, the man at the bar stood up. He walked past my booth toward the restroom. As he passed, he said quietly, "You should probably call your friend back." I looked up. "Why?" He didn't answer. He kept walking. I waited until he disappeared around the corner, then called Daniel. He answered immediately. "Why are you calling again?" I asked if he'd spoken to anyone about me being at the bar. He said no. I asked if he'd mentioned my name. He laughed. "Obviously, I know your name." I asked if he'd told anyone where I was. He said no. I hung up and looked toward the restroom. The man came back out and returned to his seat. I decided to leave. I paid for my drink, put my phone in my pocket, and stood up. The bartender looked surprised. "Leaving already?" I said yes. He glanced toward the man at the end of the bar. It was quick, but I noticed it. I walked toward the entrance. The man stood up at almost the exact same time. I stopped near the door. He stopped too. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he smiled and said, "Relax, I'm just heading out." He walked past me and opened the door. I waited inside for a few seconds before following. He went toward the parking lot. I went toward my car in the opposite direction. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The man was standing beside his vehicle. I watched him in my rearview mirror as I pulled away. I drove home using a different route than usual. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed a dark SUV behind me. I didn't think much of it until I turned onto another road and the SUV turned too. I changed lanes. It did the same. I wasn't sure if it was the same vehicle I'd seen outside the bar, so I didn't panic. I drove toward a 24-hour gas station and pulled into the parking lot. The SUV continued straight. I waited for a few minutes before leaving. When I reached my apartment, I parked in the underground garage and stayed inside the car for a moment. Everything was quiet. I checked my phone. I had one new message from an unknown number. It said, "Good choice." I stared at it. I hadn't told anyone I'd stopped at the gas station. I immediately called Daniel. He answered, and I asked whether he'd given my number to anyone. He said no. I didn't tell him about the message because I didn't want to worry him until I knew what was happening. I went upstairs, locked my apartment, and checked the windows. Nothing was out of place. I slept badly that night. The next morning, I called the bar and asked for the bartender. A woman answered. I explained that I'd been there the night before and asked if they had security footage. She said they did, but only the owner could release it. I asked when the owner would be there. She told me after 4. I went back that afternoon. The owner was surprisingly helpful. He pulled up the footage from the previous night. We watched the entrance camera first. I saw myself arrive. I saw the man in the dark jacket enter about 20 minutes later. Then I saw myself leave. The owner paused the video. "That's him?" he asked. I nodded. He switched to another camera. This one showed the parking lot. My car was visible near the entrance. The man's vehicle was parked several spaces away. Nothing seemed unusual. Then the owner rewound the footage. "Look at this." About 10 minutes before the man spoke to me, he had walked outside. He stood beside my car for nearly 30 seconds. Then he returned inside. I felt uncomfortable. "Did he touch it?" I asked. The owner zoomed in. The image was too blurry to tell, but the man had clearly been standing beside my driver's door. We watched another angle. This time we could see him holding something in his hand. It looked like a phone. He appeared to be taking a picture of my license plate. I asked whether the owner knew him. He said he'd seen him a few times, but didn't know his name. I told him about the message I'd received. He immediately offered to save the footage. I thanked him and left. I contacted the police and gave them everything I had. They told me that photographing a license plate wasn't necessarily illegal, and there wasn't enough evidence to connect the man to the message. They did, however, document the incident. For the next few weeks, nothing happened. I started taking different routes home and stopped going to that bar. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. Then, almost 2 months later, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten page. It wasn't addressed to me. It looked like part of someone's notebook. There were several dates, locations, and vehicle descriptions written down. My license plate was on the page. Next to it was the name of the bar. Underneath that, someone had written the time I'd arrived and the time I'd left. I immediately called the police. They took the letter and asked me whether I recognized the handwriting. I didn't. They never identified who sent it. The man from the bar was questioned, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything. He denied knowing me and said he couldn't remember speaking to me. I never saw him again. The bar eventually changed owners, and I stopped going out alone at night for a while. What still bothers me isn't the possibility that someone followed me. It's how ordinary everything seemed while it was happening. He didn't threaten me. He didn't corner me. He didn't even act particularly strange. He listened. He remembered details. He watched where I went. And every time I noticed something, there was an innocent explanation waiting for it. He could have heard Daniel's name. The SUV could have been following the same route. The Bluetooth device could have belonged to anyone. The message could have been a coincidence. Even the letter could have been some unrelated mistake. But when I put everything together, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. I still have the habit of checking who is sitting behind me whenever I'm in a quiet public place. I don't make a big deal out of it. I just notice people now. Because before that night, I thought danger was supposed to announce itself somehow. I thought I'd know when someone had bad intentions. I was wrong. The most unsettling people I've encountered weren't the ones shouting or acting aggressive. They were the ones who could sit 10 feet away, listen to an ordinary conversation, smile when you looked at them, and make you believe there was nothing to worry about. And sometimes, I still wonder whether that man had been interested in me from the moment I walked through the door, or whether I simply happened to notice him at exactly the wrong time. I didn't think anything was wrong when the bartender told me someone had been asking about me. At first, I actually thought he was joking. It was a little after 11 on a Saturday night, and I'd stopped at a small bar outside Columbus because I was waiting for my brother to finish work. I wasn't drinking. I ordered a soda and took a seat in the corner where I could charge my phone. The place was busy enough that nobody really stood out. There was music playing, people talking over each other, and rain hitting the windows. About 20 minutes after I arrived, the bartender came over and asked, "You waiting on someone?" I said my brother was picking me up. He nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, he came back and leaned slightly toward me. "What's your brother's name?" I looked at him. "Why?" He hesitated. "Someone called the bar asking if you were here." I immediately assumed it was my brother. "What did they say?" "They didn't give a name." He pointed toward the phone behind the counter, just asked whether a guy wearing a black jacket was sitting near the back. I looked down at my jacket. It was black. I laughed nervously. Maybe my brother couldn't reach me. The bartender didn't laugh. Maybe. I went back to my phone and texted my brother. He replied that he was still at work and hadn't called anyone. That was the first moment I felt genuinely uncomfortable. I asked the bartender if the caller had said anything else. He shook his head. "No, I told them I couldn't give out information about customers." I thanked him. A few minutes later, a man I'd never seen before walked in. He was probably in his 30s, wearing a dark baseball cap and a gray jacket. He didn't order anything. He stood near the entrance for several seconds, looked around, and then took a seat at the far end of the bar. I tried not to stare. The bartender walked over to him. They spoke quietly. The man looked toward me once, then he looked away. I told myself it was probably nothing. About 10 minutes later, my brother called. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes. I told him to park near the front entrance. He said, "Okay." I put my phone down and waited. The man at the bar stood up and walked toward the restroom. As he passed my table, he glanced at my phone. I covered the screen with my hand without thinking. He smiled briefly and continued walking. When he returned, he sat down again. The bartender came over to me. "Your brother almost here?" I nodded. "Yeah." He looked toward the front window. "Good." I asked him why he seemed nervous. He shook his head. "I'm not." He was obviously nervous. 5 minutes later, my brother texted me. "I'm outside." I stood up. Before I could reach the door, the bartender said, "Wait." I looked at him. He pointed toward the parking lot. "There's a guy standing beside your car." I looked through the window. Someone was standing near the driver's side. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the rain. I asked, "Is that the guy who came in?" The bartender nodded. "I think so." I didn't go outside. My brother called me. I told him to stay in his car and come inside instead. He walked through the front door a few minutes later. The man outside was gone. My brother looked at me and immediately noticed something was wrong. I explained everything. He went to speak with the bartender while I stayed near the entrance. The man in the gray jacket was still inside. He was looking down at his phone. My brother walked over and asked him, "Were you outside by my sister's car?" The man looked up calmly. "No." My brother didn't argue. He simply returned to me. "Let's go." We walked out together. My car was parked under a streetlight. Nothing looked damaged. My brother unlocked it and checked the doors. Everything seemed normal. We got inside his car and left. I thought the situation was over. About 10 minutes later, my brother noticed headlights behind us. A dark SUV was following at a distance. He changed lanes. The SUV did the same. He turned into a gas station. The SUV continued past without stopping. We waited for a few minutes before leaving. I remember laughing afterward because the whole thing suddenly seemed ridiculous. Maybe the SUV had nothing to do with us. Maybe the man had simply been standing near my car because he was looking for his own. We drove home. The next morning, I received a message from an unknown number. It said, "You left something behind." I assumed it was spam and deleted it. Then another message came through. Check your back seat. I immediately stopped what I was doing. I hadn't been in my car since the night before. I went outside with my brother and opened the back door. Nothing was there. We checked the entire car. Everything seemed normal. I called the police and showed them the messages. They asked whether I'd left my phone or anything else unattended. I told them about the bar. An officer contacted the bartender, who confirmed the strange phone call. The man in the gray jacket had already left before police arrived that night, and nobody knew his name. The officer told me there wasn't enough evidence to say the messages came from him. I understood. There wasn't much they could do. A week passed. Then I received another message. This time there was a photo attached. It was a picture of the outside of the bar. It had been taken from across the street. I recognized my brother's car in the parking lot. The photo was from the exact night I'd been there. I showed it to the police. They added it to the report. They also asked the bar for security footage. The footage showed the man entering, speaking briefly with the bartender, and leaving shortly after my brother arrived. Outside, another camera showed him standing beside my car. He never opened the door. He simply stood there for several seconds and walked away. The police couldn't identify him from the footage. The strange thing was that the bartender remembered him from several previous nights. He said the man had never caused trouble and usually stayed for only a few minutes. I asked why he had seemed concerned that night. The bartender said, "Because he asked me whether you came here often." I hadn't been told that before. I asked what else he'd asked. The bartender thought for a moment. "He wanted to know if you usually came alone." That answer made me uncomfortable enough that I stopped talking to the bartender and left. Months passed without anything else happening. Eventually, I stopped checking my phone every time an unknown number appeared. Then, almost 6 months later, I was cleaning out an old email account and found something I'd completely forgotten. 2 days before the night at the bar, I'd received an email from an unknown address asking whether I still lived in my apartment building. I had ignored it because I assumed it was spam. The sender had used my first name. I searched the address online and found nothing. I forwarded the email to the police, but by then there wasn't much they could do. They told me it could have been unrelated. Maybe it was. I never found out who the man was, why he had been interested in me, or whether the messages were connected to him. The bar eventually closed, and I haven't spoken to the bartender since. My brother still makes fun of me for how cautious I became afterward, but he also stopped letting me walk to my car alone at night. The part I remember most clearly isn't the man standing beside my car. It's the bartender's first question. "You waiting on someone?" At the time, it sounded like normal conversation. Looking back, I wonder whether he was simply making small talk, or whether he'd already noticed someone paying attention to me. I still don't know which explanation is worse.